Welcome back, and in this lesson we're going to follow up on the last lesson we had regarding ghost notes. So we were talking in that lesson about adding complexity to the backbone of a beat, adding fills and swing and tension and release, and using ghost notes and small kind of quick polyrhythms to add a bit of a character or personality to a beat. Let's just run with that and imagine that we're sitting behind a drum kit and you grab a stick and you hit the snare drum really, really hard. There's actually lots of things happening, and I think we need to consider this when we make rhythms on a computer. So you hit the snare drum very hard, and of course the main thing we hear is the snare. We hear the stick hitting the skin, we hear the snare vibrating, and we hear the kind of tonal release of the actual drum. We might also actually hear other things. We might make the rest of the drum kit vibrate, which might slightly trigger the tom-toms. We might make the hi-hat slightly rattle because the snare is close to it, maybe it's even touching it. Of course, we wouldn't really be conscious of this. These are very, very quiet sounds I'm talking about, but this happens. So not only that, we're also sitting in a room, in a space. Maybe we're sitting in a rehearsal room that could be quite dry, or we might be sitting in a concert hall that would be very wet and reverberant. So we'll be hearing an echo of sorts. We'll also have that echo reflecting off of our own bodies, our shoulders, our torso, into our ears at different angles. So we'll hear reflections bounce back to us in funny ways. On top of that, we might have textures in the room. There might be air conditioning. There might be things hanging in the ceiling that wobble when we hit drums. We might have watches or jewelry on that shake when we move. We might have things in our hair, etc, etc, etc. So sitting by a drum and hitting it with a stick, actually when we break it down, is a very, very complex sonic activity. So one thing we might think of when we create rhythms in a computer is to emulate this complexity somehow. And today we're not going to do it naturalistically, so we're not going to sit here and recreate perfectly what a drum kit might sound like. But I want us to take that thought and be creative with it. A nice way to do this, I find, is to add layers to our drums. This can add interesting tonal ideas or maybe intertextuality to what you're doing, depending, for example, if you were using the sound of an ocean with an 808 drum kit, maybe we have a conceptual conversation there. But we might also be adding texture and micro rhythms and swing and interesting things that we would never do by writing MIDI or by kind of preconceiving it. Let's have a look at exactly that. So here I've got a sample pack I made. We'll start here, a creaky door from my apartment. And I want to start with this one because, as you just heard, we can hear some kind of interesting rhythmic things happening. I'm going to drag this in here. I'm going to turn warping off in this case so we get the original audio. And here's an interesting trick. Actually, let's first start and hear this beat. So not super interesting, but a good kind of foundation to add things to. I'm going to start by using this snare. I want to make this more interesting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off this clip. This would work in any DAW. In Live, we use 0 to turn things off. And I'm going to cut it out and turn it back on again. Just this slice. That's kind of interesting in itself. It has like a bit of a tone and like a rhythm. But I might experiment. I might drag the start point of this sample around. And let's fade it in. Interesting. Okay. I'm going to also maybe work on this bass drum. Let's see what happens here. Cool. We got a kind of interesting call and response thing happening here. Let's also work on this final hit of this bar. That's a pretty cool swing, right? If we zoom in, it's not quite on the grid, but we've kind of got a triplet thing happening-ish. As you can see, it's not exactly on the grid. So a great example of how using audio like this can create rhythmic ideas that you just would never ever program yourself. For this example, I'm just going to duplicate this little pattern. I'm going to turn it down a bit. Let's hear the loop. And I'll turn it down even more. Maybe I'll fade this bit in as well, and I could pitch it down every other time. And all of a sudden, I'm adding lots of complexity and essentially cool polyrhythm to this idea. Finally, I might want it even more subtle, and I could maybe EQ out the low end, so it's just a kind of whisper at the top. Let's hear that. Cool. So you get the idea. I've chosen something kind of quite obviously rhythmic, but you could do this with absolutely anything. I would like to show you a similar technique or approach of doing this using a sampler. So I'm going to go back into my sample pack. And I'm going to get a different sound. I'm going to use this tool shed, because there's lots of cool rhythmic sounds in that. So in Live, I can make a new MIDI track and just drag this sample in to create a sampler or a simpler. In Logic, for example, I would use the quick sampler, which also has this kind of slicing mode in it. In other DAWs, you'll find very similar things. This is quite standard, but we're essentially using a sampler to trigger different slices of this audio clip with different MIDI notes. So what I might do here is copy my beat MIDI into this and start playing around with the settings. If I move the start position, I'll find I get different sounds. And I might play around with the sampler itself. Let's add that in with the beats. Now inside this clip, I might get creative. I won't go too far today, but let's just say this last bar, I'm going to select it all and just change the note, move it up an octave. We'll start from here and we'll hear that we get an interesting variation. Cool. So we can have lots of fun using a sampler to do this. One thing I might add here is once you've got this set up, you could, for example, just change the sample. I'm going to duplicate this track, mute the original, and I'll try this sample. I'll just drag that in, boom, and everything's set up so I can just press play and be pleasantly surprised by my new interesting beat. Again, I would never have come up with that just by clicking clips and blobs into boxes. It's lovely and organic and definitely a contrast to my very solidly electronic beat. So this is one way we can add interesting things and flavors to electronic drums. And I think now is the time to stop the video and you should spend a bit of time playing with this. I thoroughly encourage you to be as creative as you can. You could add melodic samples, you could use field recordings, you could create things to use with it. You could even use a second beat and see what happens there. Have fun, and I'll catch you in the next lesson.